Last time that we spoke, we were really positioning spirituality um,
Right.
amongst personality traits and making the case for them, making a case based on psychological science and outcomes for the study of
Data.
spirituality. Data
Say that
on the out.
four-letter word. Data. It's all based on data. And that's the currency of science. This is not
Yeah,
a rational argument. I've got data to support everything that I assert.
yeah. It was making the case,
Mhm.
a data driven case rather than a theology
Conceptual,
or a
rational.
tradition. Yeah. But what we didn't have time to go into
Mhm.
was how to incorporate that into clinical practice.
Oh,
And
yes.
I was hoping that's what we could really unpack today.
Absolutely.
And because I understand, from assessment through to treatment, that you've written a book on
I have.
on how to incorporate spirituality into clinical practice.
Hmm.
Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the first thing we got to understand is why spirituality? Why do we want it? And spirituality generates a lot of controversial reactions from people, especially if you're an atheist or agnostic. The world of spirituality or religiousness seems to be outside of your bailiwick, and it seems to leave them high and dry. The attitude is, well, if you're not religious, you really can't take benefit of all the research that we found and the value of religion. Uh, and that's a bad place to be, because all of a sudden then you start acting as a shill for religion. Harold Koenig, for example, is a large researcher at Duke University in the world of medicine, has really pioneered the value of spirituality in the treatment process of physical health disorders. Has noted the literature, the positive correlation between religious involvements and hypertension. That people who seem to be involved in their religious practices and go to masses, et cetera, tend to have better cardiovascular realities than those that don't. And one of his conclusions was, well, one of the things physicians can do is tell their clients to become more religious, which is a real problematic position to take, because now you have a physician who's now arguing that people need to become more religious, number one, which is really outside the bailiwick of a physician. Number two, it assumes that this correlational research is really causally based. It assumes that because I find a correlation between religious practices and better cardiovascular health, so do more religion, get better cardiovascular health. It doesn't always work that way, because correlation is not causality. So it puts you in a bad position. So my research, as I believe we talked about this last time, I wanted to step back from that. I'm a psychologist, wanted to study things from strictly a psychological perspective. The value of that is manifold. For number one, it means that I'm looking at universal psychological dynamics that should apply to everybody. Number two, I don't need to bring religion or spirituality in its traditionally understood ways as being religiously or theologically based, but instead want to talk about the psychological dynamics that are operating. This makes the study of the numinous relevant for all treatment professionals. There's a lot of, in the social sciences, some research has indicated that up to 60% of therapists are atheist or agnostic. So the topic of spirituality and religion is a little foreign to them. And many times they have very skeptical views of those beliefs. Historically, in psychology, it has viewed religious spirituality as a neurotic or maladaptive quality. So having people come in and say, I'm religious and spirituality, and I want you to deal with this, creates a number of personal and professional problems for therapists. But if we back away from that and look at it psychologically, a lot of these problems vanish. So the question that I've asked in my research is, what are those psychological dynamics and motivations that make religion and spirituality so important to us? And that's where the numinous comes in. I like the term numinous because it has both a theological pedigree as well as a psychological one. So we're capitalizing on those general universal human dynamics that propel us to ask these questions about personal ultimacy and engagement with life. Where do I fit in? How do I fit in? And am I good enough to fit in? Are those key questions that are there. And those are questions that everybody asks of themselves. Some people find a religious or theological solution to those issues. Other people do not. But whatever outcome you're looking for, we're all confronting the same drives. I like to think that the work that I do in the area of the Numinous helps to really pull together a lot of long-term interest that many psychologists have had in the spiritual, starting with William James and his varieties of religious experience back in 1906. You have people like Carl Jung, who did a really very interesting yeoman job in showing these broad characteristics and qualities that define our humanity. Maslow, who very much into self-actualization, but in his later years started going beyond self-actualization, looking at the spiritual as being something broader and more important for us. Gordon Allport, who sees the religious motive as the master motive. It is, of all the motivations we have, the one at the top of our motivational hierarchy that drives and organizes everything else below it. Viktor Frankl, Mr. Logotherapy himself, talking about ultimate meaning and transpersonalism as being important qualities of the human experience. And I always like Maslow, because Maslow always said, until we're able to really capture these qualities quantitatively, there's going to remain out there different kinds of mental disorders that are heretofore unclassified, because we don't have these qualities really well articulated. So the Numinous construct that I have has a lot of value to it, because it's coming out of the five-factor model, which we spoke about last time. Five-factor model being a broad-based taxonomic model of individual differences that includes, it's very comprehensive in terms of including all the psychological dynamics that psychology has considered to traditionally be personality. So, and I add to that the sixth dimension of the Numinous provides a more comprehensive explanation. So all that being said, what does that mean for us? Well, two things. One of the first research studies I recently did, which I felt was the culmination of a whole path of analyses, was showing the universality of the Numinous. That we showed the Numinous motivation inventory, the aspires, my assessment for spirituality and religious sentiment scales, were relevant for Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and the most important one was atheists and agnostics. Although we showed that measuring the Numinous is relevant and appropriate even in groups that have no religious affiliation. So that was a good thing. Then the second thing that was important was showing the clinical value of the Numinous for understanding the well-being and psychological drives and experiences of people. And what I've shown is that the Numinous, particularly this dimension of worthiness, is a significant predictor of mental illness and characterological impairment independent of neuroticism, which is the personality dimension that has really the most powerful correlation with mental illnesses. So neuroticism underlies a lot of our disorders, anxiety, depression, the personality disorders, borderline personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, etc. But worthiness or low worthiness also predicts these outcomes over and above whatever neuroticism does. So this suggests that there's a whole other dimension of functioning out there that needs to be considered by therapists if they're trying to really bring about a durable psychological solution to people's problems. And disorders like moral injury, are you aware of that term?
Yes.
I don't know. Yes, moral injury seems to be something, it's a variant of PTSD coming back from a lot of our troops overseas, and refers to a real catastrophic feeling of that I've done wrong. Then we also have things like body image dysphoria. A lot of young women really have impaired sense of worthiness because they feel their body's ugly and disgusting. It's not good enough. It doesn't fit in. We have suicide, which is the permanent solution to transient problems, but people kill themselves because they feel they have no options. They feel that they're so tragically impaired and compromised as an individual, there is nothing they can do to find reconciliation or salvation from their feelings of lack of worthiness. And then you have obviously the substance abuse disorders. A lot of that is spiritual in nature because substance abusers also feel themselves to have a very impaired sense of worthiness. And programs like 12-step programs are all designed to help people get in touch with that pain inside of them and gives them steps and strategies for resolving those issues both within themselves and with those in their lives.
Yeah, despite what some people in the history of psychology might want, it doesn't seem as though spirituality's going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
We touched on this in the first conversation that we had, but just so that this is a self-contained
Sure.
episode for people to listen to, can you just cover again exactly what you mean when you say numinous, especially so that people who don't identify as religious and might
Sure.
not identify as spiritual know what that idea is that we're talking about?
Sure. I like particularly drawing it off of the work of Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson was an ego-analytic psychologist. His contribution to psychoanalytic theory was understanding that ego development occurs across the entire lifespan. And he came up with 8 stages of development, going from trust to generativity, that reflected how we engage ourselves in the world and the psychological issues we attend to. What's interesting, at each stage, there are experiences that you have that surround the dynamic. For example, stage 1 is trust versus mistrust. So in that stage, we have some good experiences, we have some bad experiences, but the most important thing is that we have enough good experiences. You know, if it's 51 to 49% good over bad, you resolve the stage and you get to move on. So you have positive and negative outcomes. One of the positive outcomes that's associated with the trust versus mistrust is what he calls the numinous. Now, what is the numinous from Erik Erikson's perspective? It is the infant, the child. Again, you know, a famous quote of Freud, Sigmund Freud, as he was talking about a midwife who had just given birth to a child. And as the child came out, the child was covered with its own feces because it's being compressed and stuff. And Freud was asking the midwife, well, what do you make of this situation? And the midwife's response was, well, it just scared the shit out of the child. In that being born, in many ways, can be a traumatic experience for a young child. Imagine it, you're sitting in this warm environment, temperature's perfect, you're completely sated, you're at what Freud would call a homeostatic level. Then when birth happens, all bets are off. There's contractions, you're being pushed, you're being moved, you're being compressed, you're trying to fit through this very small space, and all of a sudden there's people grabbing you, pulling you out. And then you have bright lights and it's cold out there. It's not 98 degrees anymore. It's 75 or 80 degrees. That's cold. And you're hungry and things are going on. Children very quickly become, you know, they start crying, they start screaming, they have problems, they're looking for succorance and warmth. Well, it's mom who comes and hugs her child, who suckles her child out of her breast, who calms the child, makes the child feel warm and loved and safe and protected, has, from Erikson's perspective, a tremendous emotive experience for the child. Imagine being in such tension and having that tension taken away from you by this one person, by this caregiver. And from Erikson's perspective, this generates a sense of awe and wonderment and a feeling that, wow, this person is so great. They're able to make me feel so good. And it's wonderful to have them here and the power they have to do this and soothe me. That's the numinous for Erikson. Those feelings of wonderment, of awe, of the belief that something larger embraces you, soothes you, succors you, gives you the comfort to be who you are, is a very important foundational psychological experiences for folks. And that's what cascades on as adults when we have mystical experiences, or in some ways a restatement of those original postnatal encounters with caregivers, where we feel the love, the embrace, that the tensions and pain that we have is somehow being released and we're being comforted, becomes all part of a numinous experience. What I love about Erickson's model is that the numinous is at stage one. It's at the very beginning of our lives and goes and underlies all future psychological development. It's consistent with Gordon Allport, who says that spirituality or religiousness is the master motive. It's the primary motive of motives, capo de tudo capos, kind of thing. And we can see why, because it's the first dynamic emerging in our experiences with the world. So I think our numinous motivations are intrinsic to who we are, and that they're expressed at the very beginnings of our lives and continue to influence and direct where we're going as we age. So that's the numinous. That's the experience of what we're looking for. Now, when we get into numinal experiences, the dimension of the numinous is like a continuum. Okay, on the lowest end of numinal experience is what I would refer to as materialism. These are folks whose orientation is satisfying basic needs. I need to pay the rent this Friday. I need to buy food. I need to get a job. I need to do X, Y, or Z to satisfy whatever immediate problems I'm experiencing. That's on the materialistic end. As the numinous develops, our orientation starts changing. Okay, I want to satisfy my basic needs. I want to treat my family well. I want to, make sure that I take care of my family relations. So notice it's moving from me to, well, there's other people in my life that I need to tend to. And then we start moving a little bit larger into an area that Alfred Adler would call social interest. We understand we're part of a larger group and community. And I enjoy that community. I support that community. I involve myself in that community to promote its own group health, to move its agenda along, and to help improve the quality of life for everybody who's part of that community, which could be my neighborhood, could be my city, could be my state, my country, could be the world. It depends, it's how we want to define that. But there's an awareness of other groups and the need to contribute. That's the social interest, to the health of those groups. As we move a little further along, we start getting a little high on the numinous. We move to what Frankl would call a transpersonal perspective. The transpersonal perspective is one where we start thinking about our lives outside of the box of my temporal life. I like using the metaphor here of dropping a pebble into a pond. Think about the pebble as your life or our lives. The pebble hits the water and quickly sinks to the bottom and is never seen again, which is the transientness of our own lives. We live very brief lives in the broader scope of things. But yet when that rock hits the surface of the water, it creates ripples. And those ripples continue to move across the pond even long after that stone has rested on the bottom. That's a transpersonal perspective. We realize that the things we do now carry implications, not just for my life, but also beyond my life as well. So transpersonalism is broadening our appeal to larger and larger areas of concern. And we're moving into areas of concern that go beyond your own immediate interests and also beyond your own lifetime. And then the highest level is the transcendent level. This is where people begin to see their lives as basically one step in a larger ontological cycle, in that, yes, I'm living now, I will die sometime, but I will move on to another life. And we recognize or believe that there's another reality beyond the one that we're in that has its own values, it has its own ethics that are a larger, broader sense of values and ethics. And when people align themselves with those broader ethics, they come to have a transcendent perspective. The transcendent perspective is an ability of people to go all in into something. They want to be not only caring and supportive of communities, they want to transform the community as well. And it's this transformational desire that's at the top of the numinous and represents that transcendent perspective.
Okay, there's so much that I could ask, so much there to follow up, but
Sure.
But I guess I'd love to try to take the most practical from a clinical perspective tact. So say say someone's a therapist or in some way works with mental health and is convinced that this is something that is potentially useful.
Right.
You know, it's a useful lens to look at
Absolutely.
mental health.
Mhm.
How can they start going about incorporating that into their
Okay.
clinical work?
Well, my remarks up to this time were trying to provide a conceptual foundation for what's going on here, and to try at some level to make the viewers realize the value and importance of the numinous and how it drives people's lives. So from a real practical point of view, what do I do? And that's a real key question. It's one of my favorite questions. It's great to have theoretical considerations and to get into the bigger picture of ideas, but somewhere along the line, we need to ground those ideas into real practice and value. So one of the things that I've done, well, I've done several things. First, we have measures of the numinous. We have the aspires, we have the NMI. One of the first places to go is to measure people on these dimensions and give them feedback on those dimensions. What that does is it opens up an ability with your client to have a dialogue on those topics. Right? A lot of times when people go to therapy, they don't know, well, what is the therapist going to talk about? Well, we have ideas. Well, we want to talk about my sex life, my parents, my mother. They want to talk about my relationships here. So people have that framework going into a therapist's office, and figure that's all that the therapist wants to talk about. So they leave out all the non-essential qualities that don't fit into that idea, the numinous being one of them. By measuring this quality, you're telling the client, we'll talk about those existential issues if you've got them. And we open the door. The individual can get feedback on their scores on the numinous scales, which again promotes the dialogue on those topics and gets that information to come out. But it's important in a more direct way, it's important for therapists to understand the numinous status of their clients. I've developed an intake format that incorporates a lot of the traditional things that any clinical intake format has. What are your presenting problems? What is your family history like? Have you been in treatment before? Yada, 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 the standard stuff. But what I add at the end of that, so we talk about the person, the problem they're experiencing, and then finally I add what's called the predicament, the broader paradigms or motivations that are driving people's lives. And what this does, it has a set of questions there that the therapist can ask the client. Things like, when you look at your life now, what kind of metaphor would you use to describe your life? That kind of question is getting at a broad sense of how the person is really understanding themselves and situating themselves within the life that they're leading. That's the numinous. So what I have when you ask these questions are a number of possible themes or metaphors that someone would talk about. Well, I feel guilty, or I'm thinking about, getting over the problems that I'm having. It could be an issue of redemption. People may use religious language at this point here to talk about sin and guilt and reconciliation. Or they can use just normal, regular language about, I don't feel as good as other people, or I wonder if my efforts are going to pay off. I sometimes feel that, I'm working, but I'm hitting that wall all the time. In any case, all of these themes have been linked to very specific numinous motivations. And through a series of research, we were able to tag some kinds of these memes, as I call them, or life themes, assign them to the different numinous motivations. So as a therapist, you get right off the bat, right out of the client's mouth, their sense of how they understand their lives, and you're able to tag that to these numinous themes. And also you recognize that although the client may be speaking with religious terminology, that religious terminology is really a reflection of these more latent numinous dimensions. So you can connect the theological statements with these psychological realities. And as a therapist, you want to deal with those underlying psychological realities. So we have ways of diagnosing or assessing the status of our clients on the numinous. What do I do next? Well, the next step, and this is really the growing edge of the field, what are the kinds of interventions I can apply that will address these different numinous motivations? So if someone's very low on worthiness, how do I deal with that? How do I provide a therapeutic intervention that's going to address those particular issues and help work the person back to a better perspective? And I had a doctoral student, one of my last doctoral students was looking at pedophiles, and that pedophilia is a big problem. But one of the problems that people get on the sexual offender list, it's not so much pedophiles as it was sexual offenders, a little bit of a broader term. People get onto the sexual offender list for some very minor kinds of issues, but they're on it. And once you're on it, that really creates a very powerful social stigma. These individuals may not be allowed to leave their house. They have to register with their local authorities so that people in the neighborhood could see it. Are there any sex offenders in my neighborhood? They're listed, and their address is listed. People tend to avoid them. Getting a job is nearly impossible. So over time, these people are really socially isolated from everything, which creates serious problems in the area of worthiness, self-acceptance, a lot of shame that's going on. They're experiencing that just complicates the experiences that they're having. So her dissertation was based on doing a clinical intervention to help address some of those issues among sexual offenders, to help them get a better sense of worthiness and self-esteem, to feel, despite their brokenness, despite the things that they have done, they need to feel better as people so they can function as people. So they're not committing suicide or recidivating back into the problems that got them in trouble in the first place. That we need to get these individuals, we need to be able to move them along as healthier, better functioning people. So that was what I liked about her dissertation, was that it was really an effort at dealing with shame and guilt as well as low worthiness, and helping to bring some of this back to these individuals. But having clear, well-defined therapeutic interventions for these constructs has not yet been done, and that's the growing edge. In fact, I'm working with some colleagues now to develop treatment manuals that would address infinitude, meaning, and worthiness, things that clinicians can put into play in their therapy over, let's say, a course of 10 sessions, kinds of experiences, etc. And again, measuring pre and post on the Numinous to see where people are going.
And with these approaches, I know we're getting to the edge of
Sure. Yeah.
the research and where things are now. But it struck me in that example where you're talking about sex offenders that some of those themes, although they may be traditionally religious themes, they would also be traditionally themes common in the therapy room, shame and guilt and that sort of thing. So when you're starting to look at how these how a spiritual lens can be brought into treatment, is there stuff, are there aspects to these treatments that are uniquely spiritual or have a uniquely numinous flavor, or is it more perspective that you bring into the room?
Well, it's both, essentially. The most, at this point here, I mean, you've asked the real $64 question here, and we're really standing at the edge of knowledge that we have. So at this point, one of the most important things that we can do is bring the numinous perspective to the clinical consulting room. Okay, having this information creates a lens for organizing information that previously may not have been linked up with one another. And that we could talk about, I have a colleague we were talking about, he's working with a more naturalistic definition of spirituality. And for him, self-worth is this important concept. And I tell him that, well, self-worth isn't part of worthiness. Self-worth is neuroticism. We're looking at something different here with worthiness. That kind of lens, that kind of clarity, conceptual clarity, really helps to bring into focus a lot of the key elements that are unique to spirituality, We don't want to confuse worthiness with self-esteem, because somebody can feel very unworthy, but yet have good self-esteem. I feel I'm a good person, but damn it, I got rejected. I feel God is rejecting me for something, or I committed this offense that people like sexual offense, and now this has really brought a real storm of criticism and social isolation to me, and that hurts. Even though I may feel I'm a good person, or I thought I was a good person. So being able to differentiate these numinous dimensions from similarly appearing psychological ones, especially those on neuroticism, is very important. It increases the therapist's awareness of what's going on, and now they have a more precise and nuanced understanding of the presenting dynamics of the client. So that's step number one, okay? Having that awareness. Step number two, what do I do about it? Now, people use a lot of treatments like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a frequently used one. This seems to work nicely with individuals because people would bring up issues that, let's say, of a religious nature. I feel that I'm guilty and sinful. Well, let's work with that. Let's talk about those issues. Let's get into your feelings behind it, the other associations you make with this feeling guilty and sinful, and we run out our normal cognitive behavioral paradigm here, which is fine. And it has use and importance, and people can reflect back. But unfortunately, the addressing of the numinous issues may be left to the client herself to be able to draw those kinds of inferences. Because your traditional CBT therapist sees the religious material as just another sort of fodder for the cognitive mill. We can talk about your parents, or we can talk about religion, we can talk about, your sexual life. It's just another content area. What it lacks is an appreciation of the deeper, more salient aspects of numinous motivations as opposed to these other ones. Today, when we talk about spiritually integrated therapy, which is a whole big field in psychology and counseling, what it really is talking about is something like the CBT experience. And that if you're a psychoanalytic or CBT or DBT or social behaviorism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can do those interventions, but we're mindful now that we have religious content in here, and we try to include that content in the therapeutic process. That's the step that we're really working on at this point. But as I said, such attempts at integrating the religious stuff into the therapy fails to appreciate the psychological significance of the numinous in that process. And it also means that CBT does not have any necessarily uniquely dedicated techniques for addressing numinous issues. That's what's lacking in the field. That's what I like to fill in now. We're talking with other colleagues, we're talking about, well, if we're dealing with low worthiness, what can we do on worthiness as a numinous motivation? What are some of the techniques? And we can draw from perhaps religious traditions. Now remember, religion has been dealing with these kinds of existential issues for thousands of years. There are well-documented spiritual texts, spiritual direction texts that capture some of the most salient aspects of numinous crisis. And there's also techniques that the religions have come up with to help address and ameliorate these problems. These are also places to start for pulling out key psychological ideas and techniques that can be reshaped into a much more universal, psychologically appropriate intervention for all people. So
I guess that's already, yeah, I guess that has already happened in quite a big way. If you look at mindfulness and if you look at psychedelics, two practices, or if you want to look at it as techniques that can be extracted, or efforts are made to extract them from traditionally spiritual traditions and use them as therapeutic tools.
Absolutely. And that's the effort that people are making. Now, mindfulness, for example, is an interesting tool that comes from Buddhism. But sometimes two things happen here that can be problematic. Okay. We take mindfulness, people like mindfulness because it's Buddhist. Ooh, it seems spiritual. But what happens is a lot of times the mindfulness loses the spiritual dimension as it gets applied in the psychological treatment room. When we talk about mushrooms, for example, for some indigenous religious groups, this is a sacrament for them. It's a sacramental experience, much like Catholics or Christians would receive the Eucharist at their church services. I mean, it really is very spiritual, but a lot of times that spiritual dimension gets lost because the conceptual awareness of the numinous isn't there to begin with. Okay, so what we need to do is have both techniques and the numinous mindfulness awareness and put them both together so that when we use things like mindfulness, we can very clearly focus it in on the existential issues that are of concern to people working in the numinous dimension. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. That definitely makes sense. Um, yeah, that's a criticism which I've heard coming from people who are steeped in more Buddhist traditions, that
Mhm.
they they take issue with what has been left out of mindfulness as it's applied
Right.
in whether it's workplaces or the therapy room. So yeah, that's
Yeah, another related example of this is
mm,
the Jesuit tradition of what's called the examinate. Okay, the examining is something that individuals should do at the end of every day. It's where you sit and you reflect about what went right in your life, what went wrong today, what can you do to improve, how are you relating to God, how does God fit into this process, how can God help, et cetera, et cetera. That is in many ways, that is like the mindfulness issue, but it's very religiously based. I think the field is a little awkward in trying to balance out. We want to have a technique that works with everybody, whether you're religious or not, but we don't want it to be overly religious. I don't want to, again, become a shill for religion where you say, well, how does God fit into this? Well, I'm an atheist, so God doesn't. But we also don't want to lose the numinous dimension to the technique by over secularizing it. Do you follow me? So finding that balance seems to not be in the field today at this moment. And that's because there's no clear understanding of what spirituality is in the field. I mean, I have a very clear definition that's based on off of the 5-factor model and all the empirical work I've done. So that's me. But in other people and the state of the field, so to speak, doesn't have that kind of clarity. In fact, some people believe that we'll never get a consensus on what spirituality is. We'll never be able to define what it is. To me, that's a tragic problem that violates the first step of any scientific process, which is the accurate description of your phenomenon of interest. So without any consistent idea of what spirituality is, it's hard to develop treatments that focus in on spirituality since we're not sure what it is to begin with. So that's one of the factors that continues to impede development in this area. I'm trying to leverage what I've learned so far empirically to bring that information explicitly into therapy with specific treatments that are designed a priori to address the numinous motivations of infinitude, meaning, and worthiness. So that I know as a therapist, yes, we're dealing with the psychological, we talk about the psychological issues, but I definitely want to explicitly consider these dimensions as well and how the person experiences them, any problems in expressing them or managing them, and then to intervene to smooth that out and to move the person further along on their journey.
and I don't think I'd heard you mention the word infinitude before. Could you just
Oh,
explain what
right.
that means as
Sure.
well?
Well, the three numinous motivations are meaning, worthiness, and infinitude. As we said, these things tag up to the three key fears or anxieties or issues that human beings have. Those three issues are: is death the end? Is life random and chaos? And am I good enough? Those are the three questions. They reflect the three numinous motivations. So when we talk about infinitude, we're talking about people finding some durable value for the things that they're doing. We all feel that, and we all want to make a difference. Yourself, for example, you're trying to make a difference in your field. You're trying to provide something. I mean, this in some ways is a very numinous drive on your part. You're trying to provide some richness for your community. You're trying to reach out and give your fellow students and other interested observers the kind of information they need to hear to improve their own lives, to facilitate their growth, their educational experiences. That's the richness that we want to bring to life. As I say, human beings are the only animals that put value into life. What you're doing puts value into life. And that's part of our infinitude, making a difference, making a durable difference. That even though we're both going to die, we hope that the things that we're doing now, like the ripples on the lake, will continue to move out, influence others in a positive way. That gives us a certain joy. It gives us a certain motivation and excitement to do the things that we're doing. And we see that when people's infinitude increases, their excitement and their appreciation of the value and importance of their contribution becomes much more salient to them. And the awareness of the value of their contribution means they take what they're doing more seriously. They become more passionately engaged with it. And they have a vision for something bigger and brighter for the world that they want to live in. And that's all about infinitude.
I've got one more conceptual question.
Good.
When you were explaining the numinous, you used the example of the infant being born, and it was very much about a sense of feeling cared for and belonging and benevolence of the forces greater than you that are benevolent. What I didn't hear there was any aspect to the numinous or to spirituality that's difficult, that's fear-inducing. I understand that's a term that's there in religious traditions, fear of God. I understand that there can be spiritual import to psychotic experiences. It seems as though there is traditionally call it a darker side to spirituality, or a challenging side.
Absolutely. It's definitely there. In fact, problems on all three of those numinous dimensions result in all kinds of psychological issues that relate to that. For example, the most important one is the worthiness. That seems to be, of the three dimensions, impairments or problems on that dimension seem to be linked up with psychological problems. Okay. Now, does that mean the other two aren't there, don't do anything? I would say no. Those are areas where there are unclassified disorders waiting to be discovered. That we're very much aware of the worthiness issues at this point. But what is a problem in infinitude? Well, there's a group out there called terror management. Terror management is an area of psychological investigation that examines what happens to people when you stress the salience of their mortality. And what this group has found is that when you make people aware that they're going to die, and you can do this in very subtle ways, like having them walk past the cemetery, or in very direct ways, ask them a question, what do you think is going to happen to you after you die? That really creates terror in their mind. Okay, that creates a psychological terror that people need to respond to. And they respond to it by becoming more conservative, more judgmental, more group oriented, more of a we versus they mentality about life. Because what they do is they retreat into these broader organizations for the safety and security that they feel that they're lacking. So they've documented all of these psychological shifts in people's attitudes about a number of different topics. Like, for example, they would give them a story of a criminal. This person did something, they robbed a bank, got this, blah, 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 blah. Now they've been caught. How much time would you sentence them for jail? And people would say 5 years, 10 years, whatever. What they find is that people whose mortality salience has been stressed give out longer sentences than those for whom it was not stressed. Why? It's this shift towards, you got to follow the rules because the rules are safe. The rules provide security. And I'm all about security because death is ultimate chaos and terror for me. So there are issues out there on these topics, but they have not yet fully been formalized within a numinous framework because we're trying to get that model out there, trying to get that lens there so we can identify it, focus in on what it is, and then organize this. This whole terror management could be a potential set of personality disorders or just psychological disorders relating to impairments in finitude. People with meaning. I mean, people who have no meaning get really freaked out. It's, again, the same issue. What is the meaning of life? People who are unable to develop any cohesive or useful sense of personal meaning and direction become quite depressed. Many of them commit suicide because what's the point? Why am I here? What value does it have that I'm talking to you? What does it really matter? Why do I do this? That kind of questioning really undermines our ability to construct a sense of meaning and organization to our lives. I think there's a whole set of disorders that can be identified with crises on that. Now, we already know I've linked up low worthiness to a wide array of like depression, anxiety, stress experience, linked it up to disorders like borderline personality disorders, avoidant personality disorders. It's linked to these qualities quite significantly. So this adds a dimension to treating these traditional disorders by considering the numinous. But we also have to raise the question, what would existential crisis and worthlessness really look like in itself? And I think crises like that lead people quickly to commit suicide, to become exceedingly depressed and withdrawn. So being able to understand the difference between the desire for self-immolation and self-punishment, and discerning between when is that just neuroticism, when is that numinous, that's where we're at today, being able to make that kind of distinction. So we're really in the mucky area here of a lot of confusion, a lot of ambivalence and ambiguity, trying to bring clarity and focus to all of that.
And what do you think needs to happen to progress this perspective? And I guess any promising areas where you're seeing work done?
What will do that, I think, most importantly, the only way to do it. I've been in this field for 30 years. I've been advocating the need to define spirituality, the need to use like the 5-factor model to bootstrap out a construct that's unique and independent, to demonstrate its value. Some people have responded to that and are working in that area. But most importantly, I think what we need is some big organization to come out and start setting the tempo on exactly those issues. Now, what I take encouragement at, and this is very exciting development, we have a federal organization called the National Institute of Health. It is the premier scientific organization, not only in the United States, but in the world, looking at health promotion, health treatment of disorders, well-being, promotion of well-being, psychological health, etc. They have recently created a working group on religiousness and spirituality. It's a group of professionals at NIH who recognize the value of religiousness, the potential value of religiousness and spirituality in the health process, in treating diseases, in promoting wellness, and are now studying this issue with the hope of gathering enough information to be able to identify what it is this organization needs to do to move forward in conducting research in this area, and also providing funding dollars for other people to do research in this area along those same themes. This to me is very, very exciting, because NIH is the larger organization, it's the big organization. You know, if they come out and say religious spirituality is important, people will sit up and listen to that. They're going to know, well, why is it important? And their ability to articulate a scientific, empirically based research agenda, examining these topics, outlining the types of issues that need to be addressed, can really help to organize, focus, and direct the field along the lines of which we're speaking about here today. And that's happening. In fact, I've been invited to give a talk to the group in a couple of weeks, and I'm excited to share some of my viewpoints with them. My talk with them is going to be, the title I have is The Psychology of Religion and Spirituality 101, Avoiding the Pitfalls. So we'll talk about what things they need to be careful about, like not becoming a shill for religion, making sure that the constructs you study are non-redundant with already existing variables, et cetera, et cetera. And there, if they assume these ideas, and I hope they do, then as they move forward with their research agenda, that's going to be the standard that they're going to apply. And if people want to get funding on this topic, they're going to have to meet this funding. And by creating these standards, they will compel the field to really start coming together and start looking at data and really trying to find consensus as to what the numinous really is and how do we use that. So I think that's the direction that needs to happen. I'm at this point pretty encouraged by NIH and their new interest in the topic area, and I think there's potential good things coming down the road.
Well, all the best with that talk. That must be really exciting. It's a culmination to a whole career on this
Absolutely.
topic.
Well, I hope it's not the culmination, but just one more step in an ongoing process. Yeah, it is very, very exciting. In fact, yeah, I'm hoping I've shared some ideas with the groups informally. They seem to really resonate with some of the ideas that I have, given my very strong focus on science, empirical data, and the need to identify universal constructs as opposed to just religious or spiritual constructs to make it a much more broadly applicable phenomenon of interest.
That makes me think of another another obstacle that therapists who might want to start incorporating this into their work might face. How should people who want to incorporate this feel sufficiently prepared and educated? Do you need to become familiar with a whole lot of different spiritual traditions? What sort of groundwork do you think is necessary to start being able to confidently and effectively incorporating this into clinical practice?
Absolutely. Very good. Very good question. The good part of that is that a lot of professional organizations like the American Counselling Association, the American Psychological Association have come up with standards for therapists to meet to become competent in managing spiritual and religious issues. So there's a whole criteria, educational experiences, readings, etc., to inform people about these kinds of issues so that they can meaningfully engage their clients on this topic. Now, that's a good thing, and that's the beginning of doing the things that you're speaking about, because it's not a willy-nilly kind of experience. You really need to have sensitivity and awareness of different religious traditions. The question is, how much awareness of different traditions do you need to have? Do I need to have a master's degree in theology to be able to do this? Some programs that do this work say yes, you do. You need to have some kind of formal theological training. In fact, at Loyola, when I first started there, people going for a PhD in pastoral counseling had to get 21 credits in theology from an established seminary or school of theology to go along with all the credits they learned on counseling and therapy, et cetera. Now, do we need something like that extensive? I do not think so, but an awareness of and appreciation for how numinous themes become reflected in religious traditions would be a good place for study. So you don't have to really learn the ins and outs of a particular faith position. What you need to know is that when we talk about worthiness, how is that dealt with from a Christian perspective, a Buddhist perspective, a Jewish perspective? How meaning and infinitude, how are they considered from these perspectives? So that when you sit down, particularly with religiously oriented clients, as they start talking about some of those issues, like with my intake assessment, you can, they're talking about that religious theme. Well, I know that religious theme lines up with meaning or infinitude or worthiness. So that's what I want to talk about. It's the numinous motivation, because talking about that would probably go back and manage how the person speaks about it theologically or religiously. So that would be my take on it. But the fact that we have standards is a good start. It recognizes that this is an important content area, and it's more than just a cultural reality. It should be making people more than just culturally competent counselors. As you know, I'm not sure if you're familiar with multiculturalism, but helping clinicians be able to meaningfully engage people from other races, other cultures, is very important, especially here in the United States, where we need to have a sensitivity to these different perspectives, which may seem very odd and different from our own perspectives. But the numinous is more than just that. I mean, you run into a religiously committed person, clearly the religion guides how they dress, what they eat, kinds of activities they do, how they relate to other people. Very cultural, but there's something even more importantly foundational than just those cultural expressions. And by having these religious competency issues, you're helping clinicians to recognize there's more than just cultural issues going on here. There's these other dimensions as well that have to be addressed. So it's all good stuff.
Is there anything important on this topic that we haven't yet covered? It feels as though we've given it a really good sweep, but just want to put
Yeah.
that to you. Is there anything? Yeah.
No, I think we've covered all the major issues that are going on. I guess what I'd like to say is that there still is a lot of challenges in front of us. A lot of people, when they hear spirituality and religion, they give you the look, oh, what's that? Is this really important? There's a lot of resistance still in the social and medical sciences to considering religion and spirituality. For many, it seemed to be outside of their professional bailiwicks, which, if you're talking about religion, it is. But the psychological aspects aren't outside their bailiwicks. As long as we're able to keep it scientific, that's always going to be a good thing. But it is an uphill battle in trying to get this agenda out there, to get the information to professionals, and to have it in a way that makes them understand it and want to accept it. So that's still the big challenge. It's still controversial in many ways. And a lot of that's because we haven't been able to come up with a consensual psychological definition of what religiousness and spirituality is all about. And again, that fuels a lot of my own work. I try to be very clear on these topics there. But that would be the only last thing I would say on religion and spirituality. That's the big thing that's there.